The morning light hangs low over the slopes of Mount Parnassus as you slowly make your way along the ancient stone road leading toward Delphi. This road was once crowded with pilgrims and royal envoys, but now it feels strangely abandoned, as if the world has quietly stepped back from this sacred place. All that is left is the gentle sound of wind sliding across the mountains, and the faint echo of your own footsteps moving steadily toward a destiny that has been waiting in silence. The stones beneath your feet are cold and worn smooth by centuries of travelers who came here, seeking answers from a world beyond their understanding. As you walk, you notice how the early light reveals the cracks and faded inscriptions carved into the roadside monuments. They are reminders of victories long forgotten and offerings made to gods who no longer speak with the clarity they once did. On your left, old cypress trees rise like dark pillars, their branches swaying slowly as if acknowledging your presence. On your right, the terrain drops into a deep valley filled with layers with mist that hang motionless between the cliffs. The entire landscape has an atmosphere of quiet anticipation, as though everything around you, the mountain, sky, trees, even the cold air, has paused to observe your approach. Far ahead, the first outlines of the sanctuary rise into view. The long stairway carved into the mountainside, the broken columns leaning at different angles after centuries of earthquakes, and behind them, the faint silhouette of the main temple where the Oracle once spoke with a voice that bent the fate of empires. There is no sound of other travelers, no priest calling instructions, no guards watching the entrance. There is only the slow, steady whisper of the wind brushing against the ancient stones, carrying with it the unmistakable sense that the age of prophecy is nearing its final breath. You continue walking forward, and with every step, the mountain air grows heavier, filled with the scent of old incense and the lingering presence of countless rituals performed here long before your time. These rituals once connected mortals to the divine, but now they feel like echoes of a world that is slipping into stillness. And as the great temple comes into clearer view, standing quiet and almost mournful beneath the shifting morning light, you begin to feel that you, not simply approaching a sacred site, but the final remnants of an era whose last moments are unfolding slowly before you. As you reach the base of the sanctuary stairway, you pause for a moment, allowing your eyes to adjust to the way the early light falls across the ancient steps. Each one is uneven and worn down by the slow erosion of centuries. You realize that despite the silence surrounding you, this place still carries the weight of countless rituals, sacrifices, questions, and fears that once filled every corner of this complex with restless human intention. You begin to climb, moving slowly up the wide staircase that leads toward the heart of the sanctuary. With every step, the temperature seems to drop slightly, as if the air itself becomes denser the closer you get to the temple. This is where the oracle once breathed in the vapors rising from the earth, and spoke truths that were believed to come directly from Apollo, the god whose presence once gave this mountain its sacred authority. The stairway curves gently, revealing long corridors of broken columns rising on both sides like the ribs of some ancient stone creature. Each column is cracked and chipped, leaning in ways that show how many earthquakes and storms have passed since the height of this place's power. Yet they still stand as though held upright by a mixture of stubbornness and reverence. You notice the faint smell of old smoke incense burned long ago in ceremonies now forgotten. As the wind drifts through the empty courtyard, it carries that smell toward you, letting you imagine how this place must have once felt when crowds filled the air with prayers, offerings, and hopeful voices asking the oracle for guidance on war, famine, marriage, voyages, and dreams. The courtyard stretches before you now, wider than you expected and filled with low stone platforms where statues once stood. Some remain faceless or half-buried, while others lie toppled on the ground, their features smoothed into unrecognizable shapes by the slow work of wind and rain. The overall quietness feels almost deliberate, as though the gods themselves stepped away slowly and carefully, leaving their house untouched but empty. Toward the far end of the courtyard, the main temple stands partially shaded by the angle of the rising sun. Though its roof has collapsed in several places, it still holds a strong commanding presence, the kind that suggests that even in its decline, this is a place where the boundary between the earthly and the divine once grew thin enough for voices to pass through. As you approach the entrance, the shadow inside the temple seems thicker than it should be. It's not threatening, but heavy with the residue of centuries of whispered prophecies. You feel the strange sensation that anyone who steps across this threshold is entering more than a building they are entering. The memory of a civilization trying quietly to hold on to its last thread of divine connection. You take a slow breath, step forward and cross into the cool darkness of the temple interior, where the final days of the oracle are waiting for you, preserved in a silence that feels both ancient and immediate, like something that has been expecting your arrival. The moment you step inside the temple, the air changes. It becomes cooler, heavier, filled with a stillness that has settled here over decades. It's as if every stone, every column, every crack in the floor has absorbed the fading echo of countless voices that once sought divine answers within these walls. Your eyes adjust to the dim interior, where streaks of sunlight slip through the damaged roof, falling in long shafts that illuminate floating dust particles, each one drifting as if time itself has slowed down. The scent here is different from the air outside, more ancient, a mixture of old incense, mineral, earth, and the faint metallic hint of offerings that once hung from the walls, now gone. As you move deeper, your footsteps create soft echoes that stretch far into the shadows, revealing just how large this chamber is. For a brief moment, you can imagine the great ceremonies that once took place here. Priests moving in slow, deliberate patterns, torches flickering against the walls, and the oracle sitting at the center of the sanctuary, breathing in the earth. Vapors as the words of prophecy emerged from her in a voice both feared and revered. Your hand brushes the cold surface of a cracked marble column. The carvings are faded, but the grooves beneath your fingertips tell you these symbols once held profound meaning, enough to alter the decisions of entire kingdoms. Ahead, the central passage narrows, leading toward the innermost chamber, the Adyton, the forbidden space where only the oracle and her attendants were once allowed. The golden decorations are long gone, but the atmosphere still carries a sense of boundary, as though the remnants of divine authority linger. The deeper you walk, the quieter it feels, as if each step pulls you further from the human world. Even the wind outside seems to fade, leaving only the low, steady hum of the mountain itself, sound so subtle you not sure if you hearing it or just sensing it. The darkness ahead thickens, not in a threatening way, but suggesting depth, history, and the weight of thousands of moments stacked on top of each other. With each step, you begin to feel that someone else may be inside the temple, not moving, not speaking, but simply present. A presence neither living nor supernatural, but something you can only describe as the lingering consciousness of a place that once held enormous power. You reach the threshold of the inner chamber, the final room where the oracle spent most of her life. As your eyes settle on the faint outline of a stone platform in the center, you realize the final chapter of this story begins here, in a room that has been empty for years, yet still feels as though the last oracle has only just stepped away. As you cross into the attend, the secret chamber where only priestesses once walk, the air grows denser. It carries a deep, earthy scent that seems to rise from cracks in the stone floor. These are the same cracks through which ancient geothermal vapors once seeped. Vapors the Greeks believed were the physical breath of the god Apollo, the very substance that opened the oracle's mind to visions far beyond human sight. The room is small, yet it feels infinitely more significant. Every detail, every worn stone, every faint discoloration on the wall carries the memory of countless prophecies that shaped the destinies of kings, cities, and empires. A faint light spills in from a break in the ceiling, illuminating a stone tripod in the center. Its 3 legs are splayed like the roots of an ancient tree, holding the weight of history. The seat atop it is cracked and half-collapsed, but you can still imagine the final oracle sitting here, her posture slightly bent, her hands clenched lightly as she struggled to maintain old traditions in a world that was already moving on. You walk closer and the silence deepens, feeling almost alive, as if the chamber is listening to your movements. The air seems heavier near the tripod, filled with a thickness that suggests invisible movement, a reminder of the mysterious vapors that once carried the priestess into trance after trance. There are faint scratch marks on the stones nearby, perhaps from the nails of a Pythia who leaned forward during a particularly intense prophecy. Seeing them, you sense the weight of the final years when the fumes grew weaker and the rituals more symbolic. A small bronze bowl lies overturned in the corner, green with age, almost fused to the ground. It once held sacred water from the Castalian spring, which the oracle sipped to purify her mind. Now, it's a relic of a world fading into memory. You stand in the center and close your eyes. As the stillness settles around you, you can almost imagine what the final oracle might have experienced during her last prophecy. How she would have inhaled deeply, waiting for the earth to speak, only to find the vapors thin, the visions blurred, the divine voice silent, replaced by the echo of her own breath. Outside these walls, the Roman Empire was tightening its grip. New religions were emerging, and the ancient traditions were being pushed toward extinction. whispering her final messages to the few who still believed, even as she sensed the sanctuary was losing its connection to the power it once held. The air grows cooler as you step back from the tripod. The shadows in the corners feel deeper now, as though they carry the silent memory of her final trance, her final breath. In this room, time feels strangely layered past and present, overlapping so softly you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. For a moment, it feels as though the oracle's presence lingers, not as a ghost, but as the last echo of a role that shaped civilizations before slowly dissolving into the calm darkness around you. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories hidden in the quiet corners of our world. As you step back from the center of the Adyton, you let your eyes adjust to the soft gray light drifting through the broken ceiling. It's easy to imagine the sanctuary's end as a sudden collapse, but the reality was likely a long, slow decline. A period when believers still arrived, one by one or in small, weary groups. They carried offerings wrapped in cloth or sealed in clay jars, hoping the fading voice of the Pythia might still offer guidance, reassurance, or even the faintest echo of the God they had trusted for centuries. These were the years when the roads to Delphi grew quieter. Caravans that once stretched across the mountains now held only a handful of travelers. Pilgrims who had journeyed for weeks would arrive at the edge of the sanctuary and look around, confused by the empty courtyards and half-abandoned altars. They must have wondered if they'd come to the right place, or if the world had already left this sacred site behind. Some of these visitors were soldiers returning from distant campaigns. Their armor was dulled and dented, their faces etched with the exhaustion of battles fought far from home. They came seeking clarity. Should they lay down their weapons or continue serving a fading empire? They approached the temple with the same reverence as their ancestors, but found fewer priests to greet them, fewer rituals to perform. The divine thread they hoped to grasp felt like it was slipping through their fingers like smoke on an indifferent wind. Others were farmers, weary from years of uncertain harvests. They still believed Apollo's voice could offer hope, or at least comfort. They would kneel in the outer courtyard, holding small baskets of grain or fruit with trembling hands. Their whispered prayers carried the quiet desperation of people whose world was changing faster than they could understand. The priests older now and fewer in number struggled to maintain the old rituals. Their own voices carried a tired tremor as they guided pilgrims through what had become fragile echoes of ceremonies once filled with grandeur. There were also scholars and poets who came not just for prophecy, but for the fading beauty of this place. They walked slowly between the columns, pausing to trace inscriptions carved by hands long dead. They sensed the weight of history pressing gently on their thoughts. Some wrote quietly on small wax tablets, recording their impressions of a sanctuary that felt like a living memory, slipping from the present moment and sinking into the depths of antiquity. But among all these visitors, you can almost see the faces of those who came seeking something more personal, lancers to grief, to illness, to loss. They carried sorrow in their eyes and approached the oracle not for political counsel, more human, more fragile. And though the oracle's power was waning, these individuals knelt the same way thousands had before them, believing that even a faint whisper from the god might help them carry their burdens a little longer. And so, the sanctuary didn't fall silent all at once. It dimmed slowly, like a lamp running out of oil. It flickered with one final glow each time a pilgrim arrived, each time a priest lit a final offering, each time the Pythia sat upon her tripod and breathed deeply, hoping the earth would speak again. Even as the vapors grew thin and the visions became blurred, dominated by human memory rather than divine presence. As you stand here in the quiet of the Adyton, you feel the weight of those final visitors, their footsteps, their hopes, their questions lingering in the stone. They're preserved not as ghosts, but as impressions, like the faint warmth left behind after a hand lifts from a surface. In this stillness, it becomes clear that the last prophecies spoken here were not messages for kings or generals, but quiet answers given to ordinary people who still believed in something greater than themselves, even as the world shifted toward a new age. A cloud drifts across the sun, casting the room into a softer gray, and for a moment, the Adyton feels suspended in time, holding the memory of those final visitors in a silence that echoes across the centuries. As you leave the silent chamber and step into the dim corridor leading out, you sense that the oracle's decline wasn't just about one priestess. It was the slow unraveling of an entire priesthood. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to ancient rituals, now struggling to preserve traditions that no longer carried the same power or authority. This corridor opens into a small ritual room where priests once prepared offerings, baskets of laurel leaves, bowls of barley, bronze cups of oil. It's nearly empty now, but you can imagine how it once sounded. With robed figures moving with measured steps, their quiet footsteps echoing as they recited hymns sung for hundreds of years. Run your fingers along this low altar, its edges rounded from centuries of use. You can see faint stains left by countless offerings burned here, the smoke rising to curl into the rafters, carrying the scent of sacrifice into the temple's heart. You can feel the presence of those final priests who stood here, trying to recreate the ceremonies exactly as their ancestors did, even as the energy of this place slipped away like sand through their fingers. Some were young men who had joined the priesthood with devotion, believing they would serve a powerful God whose voice shook empires. They discovered they were living in an age when the sanctuary was losing its influence, its followers, and its very foundation of belief. Though they remained loyal, their voices carried a quiet sadness whenever they chanted the hymns of Apollo, as if calling out to a presence that no longer answered with the same clarity. Others were older priests who had served through decades of prosperity. They remembered the bustling crowds, the long processions, the endless stream of ambassadors and generals seeking prophecy. For these elders, the quiet halls were a personal sorrow, a reminder that everything they had dedicated their lives to was slowly dissolving into memory. You can imagine one of these elders, a man with silver hair and tired eyes, standing in the courtyard at sunset. He'd watched the last light fall against the columns, knowing the world no longer believed in divine voices emerging from underground vapors. New religions were spreading across the empire with unstoppable momentum, while the old temples crumbled. He would have gathered the remaining priests in a small circle, their candles flickering, and encouraged them to continue their duties. Not because the gods demanded it, but because these traditions were the final threads holding together a sacred world that had shaped their people for centuries. And so they continued. They lit lamps even when fewer pilgrims came. They burned offerings even when the scent no longer felt like a message to heaven. They swept the temple floors even when the dust returned, moments later, as if the mountain itself was gently reclaiming the sanctuary. In a small storage room, you see where clay tablets were once kept records of offerings, names of pilgrims, instructions for rituals. The shelves are mostly empty, but a few broken tablets lie scattered on the floor, their inscriptions faded You kneel and brush the dust away, imagining the final priest who placed them here. Unaware he might be the last person to ever touch them. A soft breeze moves through the doorway, and the broken tablets make a faint rattle like the whisper of a language that once shaped civilizations, now speaking only in fragments. The halls around you feel filled, not with loss, but with a deep, calm acceptance, the kind that comes at the end of a long story. Those who lived it knew their chapter was closing, yet they continued their roles with dignity, honoring the past even as the future moved quietly beyond their reach. The final priesthood lingered like a gentle imprint, not haunting the temple, but softly protecting its memory, ensuring that even as the sanctuary entered its final days, it did so with grace. Stepping out toward the outer colonnade, the light changes, growing softer and thinner. It is in this shifting glow that you begin to think of the final pilgrims who climbed this sacred slope. They arrived not with confidence, but with quiet hesitation, unsure if the ancient sanctuary still held any power. These last pilgrims were different. They traveled alone or in small groups, moving with a tentative reverence, as if visiting a once mighty king now living in a quiet house. Each carried a hope that, even in decline, the oracle might offer a single thread of clarity. Imagine a young woman arriving at dawn, her sandals dusty, her hands gripping a clay jar of olive oil, offering her grandmother told her about. As she climbs the last steps, she pauses, noticing the silence, the absence of crowds. When she reaches the great courtyard, she sees only one priest sweeping the stone floor, his movements slow with ritual patience. He greets her with a softness that feels like a remnant of a bygone age. She offers her jar, and the priest accepts it with a respectful bow. In that simple exchange, tradition continues fragile, yet enduring. Farther along, picture an elderly man on a stone bench, leaning on a wooden staff. He's journeyed across regions shaken by upheaval, seeking reassurance one last time. He remembers childhood stories of a god whose voice could shape empires. Now he sits in the fading light, hoping not for visions, but for a moment of stillness, a connection to the centuries behind him. There were others, two merchants stopping out of habit, soldiers seeking a touch of the ancient before returning to battle, mothers with sick children hoping the gods hadn't entirely departed. Many expected disappointment, yet when they stood inside the dim hall, a strange calm often descended upon them. It wasn't the ecstasy of old texts, but a gentle quiet that eased their worries, even if no prophecy was spoken. There were still moments when the Pythia sat on her tripod, when her voice emerged in low, wavering syllables. The priests translated with a reverence born more from memory than conviction. And when the last pilgrims listened, they sometimes wept not because the words held divine certainty, but because they knew they were witnessing the end of something vast. These final pilgrims left the sanctuary with a quiet sense of closure. They walked down the mountain knowing they had seen a fading light before it was extinguished, that they had stood within the last breaths of an ancient voice that had guided humanity for nearly 1,000 years. As you walk across the courtyard, you feel the echo of their journeys beneath the stones up. Soft, steady rhythm reminding you that even as the oracle weakened, it continued to draw people toward it, refuses to be forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like and subscribe for more. As you move deeper into the courtyard and pause near the cracked steps that lead toward the inner sanctuary, you begin to sense the weight of a truth that settled over Delphi during its final years. It's a truth whispering that the Oracle, as once mighty voice for centuries to be the living breath of Apollo, had grown faint. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, almost tender unraveling, like the last ember of a great fire glowing softly before turning to ash. For most of its existence, Delphi had been a place where the boundary between mortal and divine felt thin. The voice of the god could flow through the Pythia with a force so overwhelming that kings trembled and generals halted entire armies, waiting for her final words. But in these twilight days, the voice that once thundered from beneath the earth no longer rose with the same power. The priests sometimes waited for hours in the dim chamber, only to hear a whisper so fragile that they feared even repeating it aloud might break it. The vapors that once surged upward from hidden fissures, filling the chamber with a warm, intoxicating haze, had weakened as well. They now emerged as a thin, wavering breath of earth that barely curled above the floor. The priestsmen, trained to read divine patterns in every movement of the oracle, found themselves staring at the thin fumes with quiet confusion, unsure whether the god had grown distant or whether the world itself had changed in ways they could neither control. There were days when the Pythia, already aged, would sit perfectly still upon the sacred tripod, her thin hands trembling on her lap. She waited for the familiar surge of divine heat to rise through her body But instead of the overwhelming trance that once seized her with clarity, she would feel only a faint heaviness in her breath, as though the mountain were exhaling a memory rather than a command. In those moments, the priests would stand in uneasy silence, exchanging careful glances. They knew that the pilgrims waiting outside would soon be let in, hopeful and anxious, unaware that the oracle's once unstoppable current of prophecy had diminished to something soft and uncertain, something that even the most faithful servants of Apollo could barely interpret. The fading of the god's voice was not a failure, nor a punishment, nor the result of disbelief. It was something far more complex, an outcome shaped by shifting empires, new religions rising across the world, and the slow retreat of old traditions that had once woven humanity and divinity together into a single braided fabric. As that fabric loosened, the god's voice simply found less space to move through, like wind trying to pass through walls where cracks had once existed. There were whispered debates among the priests in the late evenings when the air grew cold and the temple corridors echoed softly with the sound of distant insects. Some argued that Apollo was choosing to withdraw willingly, allowing the world to step forward into a new era without the constant pull of prophecy. Others believed that the god was still present but overshadowed by the expanding reach of new beliefs carried on the tongues of travelers from faraway lands. But regardless of the reason, the truth could not be denied. The voice that had guided cities, shaped civilizations, and warned empires of their rise and fall had quieted to a thin murmur. A murmur so delicate that the Pythia herself sometimes could not discern whether it was the god or simply her own fading strength. And yet, even in its weakest moments, the oracle retained a strange and haunting beauty. There was something profoundly human about watching a great power soften gracefully instead of disappearing in violence or chaos. Something quietly noble in the way Delphi continued its rituals, honoring the god even as his voice drifted further from the mortal world. You step to the edge of the inner corridor, feeling the cool air rising from the shadowed chamber below. For a moment, you almost believe you can hear the faint echo of the god's final whisper, sound so soft it exists more in the bones than in the ears. It's a reminder that some endings are not loud or dramatic, but arrive like the slow dimming of light at the end of a long day. As you step away from the entrance, to the inner sanctuary and walk slowly toward the outer edge of the temple grounds. The landscape of Delphi opens before you. The view is so vast and quiet that it almost feels like a memory rather than a place. The wide Pleistos Valley stretches out beneath the mountains, its olive groves shimmering gently in the shifting afternoon light. Each tree swaying as if whispering the stories of centuries that have passed through this sacred region. The valley below, once filled with the movement of travelers who arrived from distant lands, hoping to hear the voice of Apollo, now looks strangely empty. It carries an almost solemn stillness that mirrors the fading breath of the Oracle herself. As you let your eyes move across the ridges and terraces, you begin to understand how deeply the landscape was intertwined with the sanctuary's power, how the mountains, the winds, the silence, and the earth itself once created the perfect stage for divine communication. But now, that harmony feels slightly out of balance, as though the natural world is adjusting to the slow withdrawal of something ancient that once pulsed through the stones. Even the wind seems to move differently here, softer and thinner, curling around the columns with the gentleness of a tired spirit. Far down the valley road, you imagine the last few processions of pilgrims winding their way upwards, mall. Scattered groups instead of the long, unbroken lines that once stretched as far as the eye could see. They moved with a sense of hope mixed with uncertainty. Some of these travelers came from villages shaken by famine or conflict, carrying small offerings wrapped in cloth. These offerings would have been considered humble in earlier centuries, but now felt significant simply because they represented the last strands of faith woven between the people and their God. Others arrived out of obligation, feeling that they must honor the old ways before embracing the new beliefs spreading across the land. As if performing one last ritual might preserve a connection that was rapidly fading. As the pilgrims climbed the steep paths, they passed the ruins of older structures, crumbling treasuries, weathered by centuries of sun. They reminded them of a time when every kingdom sought Delphi's favor, a time when armies consulted the oracle before marching, and cities reshaped their laws based on her words. Now, these broken stones stood like silent witnesses to the sanctuary's long decline, their shadows stretching across the ground like the final pages of a disappearing era. You walk along the edge of the terrace, where the priests once stood to greet arriving visitors. Although the platform is cracked and uneven, you can almost picture the scene as it might have appeared in the Oracle's final years. A small group of elderly priests performing the traditional rites with unwavering dedication. Their movements were slower than their predecessors, but no less precise, as if they believed that continuing the rituals properly might somehow keep the goddess presence anchored in this place a little longer. The priests' robes, once vibrant with color, would have been faded and worn, their sandals thin from decades of walking these same sacred pathways. Their faces were marked not only by age, but by the subtle sorrow of witnessing a divine tradition they had devoted their lives to slowly losing its radiance. Yet, even with that sorrow, there was a quiet strength in the way they carried themselves, a determination to uphold the sanctuary's dignity until its final breath. As you breathe in the dry, warm air of the mountainside, you feel the mixture of endings and echoes, like a thin, transparent veil. It's a reminder that great powers rarely disappear in a single moment, but instead drift away gradually, leaving behind a landscape filled with shadows of what once was and traces of what still lingers in the stones, the soil, and the whispering wind. The sacred valley stretches endlessly before you, and in that vast stillness, you sense that the story of Delphi is approaching its final turning point, a moment when the world outside will soon begin to move in a direction that no longer looks toward the mountain for guidance, leaving the oracle to fade, not in chaos, but in a long, slow, deeply human twilight. As you return toward the inner side of the sanctuary and pause near the weathered flagstones that form the floor of the oldest part of the temple, you begin to notice something subtle, small fractures running beneath your feet. Thin lines are spreading slowly across the ancient stone lines that seem to echo the internal weakening of Delphi itself, as if the sanctuary's physical structure has begun to mirror the fading voice of the oracle in a quiet, unspoken harmony. These cracks were not sudden or violent. They developed over years, appearing first as hairline marks that priests dismissed as natural effects of time. But they gradually deepened until they became unmistakable reminders that even the earth beneath the temple was shifting, loosening and releasing its ancient tension in slow breaths rather than dramatic eruptions like a tired giant unwilling to disturb its own rest. Long before the temple weakened, the Pythias of earlier centuries spoke of strange movements beneath the ground, gentle tremors that carried warmth, vapors, and a kind of invisible pressure that once surged upward during prophecy sessions. But now, in the final days, that movement has diminished to a faint, rhythmic pulse, hardly stronger than a tired heartbeat. A pulse that rises only occasionally, and even then with a softness that feels more like memory than power. When you kneel to touch the cracked stone, the surface feels cooler than the air around. It tanned, the sensation travels faintly through your fingertips. It's as if the last remnants of the sacred vapors are still there, hidden deep within the mountain, unable to reach the surface the way they once did, trapped under layers of earth that no longer open themselves willingly to the world above. The priests knew this long before the pilgrims realized it. They felt the change first, not through signs from the God, but through their own bodies, through the lighter scent of the earth, through the weakening of the fumes that once filled the inner chamber, through the silence that often accompanied the Pythias sessions when the mountain offered nothing to carry her voice into the trance. In the evenings, after the sanctuary grew quiet and the last pilgrims descended into the valley, the priests would sometimes gather near these very stones. They would lower themselves slowly to sit along the temple floor, their robes pooling around their feet as they traced the cracks with thoughtful hands. They spoke in low tones about the future of Delphi, their voices filled not with fear, but with a gentle acceptance that the world was changing in ways they could not reverse. Some believed the God was simply choosing silence, withdrawing his voice in the same way a sunset retreats across the horizon, slow and inevitable. Others thought the mountain itself was closing its breath, sealing the fissures that had once allowed divine vapors to rise into the chamber, as if the earth had grown weary of carrying the burden of prophecy and longed for its own long sleep. Yet, despite the cracks, despite the fading warmth beneath the stone, despite the old structure's slow surrender to time, the sanctuary did not feel abandoned. Instead, it carried the quiet dignity of something reaching the natural end of an extraordinary life. A life marked by centuries of questions, answers, prayers, rituals, and countless human footsteps that had shaped the temple into a place where the boundary between the seen and unseen was once unmistakably thin. A soft breeze drifts through the broken doorway, stirring a few scattered leaves across the cracked floor. As you watch them move in a lazy spiral, you realize that even the smallest shift of air feels significant here, as though the temple itself is breathing in long, slow cycles, inhaling the past and exhaling the faintest traces of what remains. The cracks beneath your feet, though growing and spreading, do not speak of collapse. They speak of transition, of an ending happening not with destruction, but with gentle unraveling. A silent surrender in which the earth, the god, and the sanctuary all seem to understand that their shared story has entered its final chapters. And in that silent understanding, you feel a strange warmth, a calm acceptance that great sacred places do not simply die. They fade like old constellations, retreating slowly into the vastness of memory, while leaving behind an echo so steady that even centuries later, anyone who stands here will feel it lingering beneath the surface. As the hours drift across the sanctuary and the last light of the afternoon sinks behind the cliffs of Parnassus, a subtle stillness settles over the temple. It's an unusual, almost fragile quiet that stretches across the stone columns, hangs gently between the shadows, and seems to deepen the air itself, as if the entire mountain is holding its breath in a moment of hesitant reflection. For centuries, priests believe that the presence of Apollo shimmered invisibly through every corner of the sanctuary, moving through the warm currents rising from the earth, stirring the air in the Adyton, and guiding the Pythia's voice with an unseen hand. But now, in these last days, that presence feels thinner, as if the god has stepped back into some distant, unreachable horizon, leaving behind only a soft echo of what once felt radiant and unmistakably alive. Pilgrims who arrive in this late era still approach with reverence. They still climb the sacred path, still bring laurel leaves, coins, questions, and whispered hopes. But many find something different waiting for them, a quiet so deep that it feels like a message in itself, a silence so complete that it carries the weight of a prophecy without needing a single spoken word. The priest, though trained to maintain composure, sense this absence with a familiarity that carries both sorrow and understanding. They know the history of gods who rise and fade, worlds that shift, and civilizations that lean into new beliefs. The sanctuary that once defined an entire era now feels like a great lamp whose flame has shrunk to a faint blue ember, still glowing but no longer burning bright enough to cast its former brilliance across the land. Inside the darkened Adyton, where centuries of prophecies had unfolded in swirls of vapor, light and trembling voices, the air now feels calm to calm. It's so still that even the Pythia herself, when she descends into the chamber, must rely more on memory and ritual than on the sudden, overwhelming surge of divine heat that once filled her senses in a way that left no room for doubt. She sits quietly on the three-legged stool, her hands resting on her lap, her breath steady and controlled. And though she still closes her eyes and allows the dim glow of the oil lamp to blur into a soft orange haze, the trance comes. More slowly now, like a river losing its current, moving forward, and the gentle insistence of tradition. The priests watch from the shadows, their faces calm but lined with a quiet recognition. They observe the small hesitations in her breathing, the longer pauses between her phrases, the way her voice no longer echoes with the same layered resonance that marked the Oracle's earlier centuries. Though they record her words with the same careful strokes on clay tablets, they know that the god's voice, once strong enough to shape kings, cities, wars, and futures, now reaches them only through thin, fleeting threads that shimmer briefly before fading. Outside the chamber, the larger world has already begun to change. Political powers shift. New religions rise. Empires edge closer to Delphi with different beliefs and different centers of gravity. The people who once looked to Apollo for guidance now scatter their questions across many sources, each competing voice pulling gently at the edges of the world that once converged here at the foot of Parnassus. And yet, even as the presence of the god fades, it does not disappear entirely. There are still moments soft, rare, almost accidental, when a warm breeze slips through the doorway at the exact moment the Pythia takes a slow breath, or when a faint tremor rolls through the stone floor like a half-forgotten heartbeat, or when the scent of laurel rises unexpectedly from the air, gentle and thin, but unmistakable, like a memory returning for a brief instant before dissolving again into the quiet. These moments remind the priests of the ancient bond between the god and the sanctuary, a bond that, though frayed and weakening, still carries the dignity of something too old and too sacred to vanish in a single generation. They feel it not in grand miracles, but in small subtleties, the way the last sunlight touches the temple, steps, the way echoes linger a fraction longer than expected beneath the columns. The way silence settles with a toughness that feels intentional rather than empty. You stand at the edge of the Adyton, watching as the Pythia slowly rises from the stool, her movements steady but lacking the tremor that once followed her trances. As she walks toward the staircase, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a dying lamp, you sense that she too feels the shift deeply. The God who once spoke through her with overwhelming clarity has begun to speak only through shadows, memories, and the lingering warmth of former glory. In this fading presence, Delphi begins to reveal its most human truths, that even the greatest sacred places must one day step back, not as failures or fallen wonders, but as ancient voices, completing their final lines, preparing to rest after centuries of carrying the weight of the world's questions. And as the evening deepens, you realize that the fading of the God is not a disappearance. It is a transition, a retreat into a quieter realm where the echo remains long after the voice itself has grown still. As the seasons continue their slow cycle across the slopes of Parnassus, a different kind of visitor starts to appear on the sacred way. They arrive not with the same certainty or reverent awe of earlier generations, but with a softer, more tentative curiosity, as though they have come not to seek answers, but to witness the final breaths of a world recognizing its own twilight. These late pilgrims don't travel in large groups. They come in pairs, small clusters, or alone, moving with a gentleness that reflects the world around them. When they finally reach the temple, they pause at the base of the steps, sensing they are stepping into a place nearing the end of its long story. They approach the priests with careful expressions, their voices low, their offerings modest mall woven baskets, simple bronze coins, bundles of herbs. Instead of grand inquiries about wars or kingdoms, they ask quieter questions about the health of a child, the safety of a journey, the meaning of a troubling dream. The priests receive them with patient kindness, guiding them through the ancient rituals. But even as the incense burns, the smoke rises with a thinner curl, as if reluctant to carry the same weight of prayer it once held with ease. Inside the Adyton, the Pythia still performs her role with dignity, but her visions now arrive in soft flickers like ripples skimming across a still pool. Those who receive her final prophecies don't leave shaken, but thoughtful, as though given a gentle reminder of truths they already suspected. Some of these late pilgrims don't come for prophecy at all. They come simply to see Delphi before its voice grows completely silent, to walk the sacred path, to breathe the mountain air, to place a hand on stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and feel the lingering warmth of a place that once shaped the fate of nations. The priests hear stories of new faiths rising and old temples losing followers. They listen with a deep, reflective sadness, as though hearing the final chapters of a book they have lived inside their entire lives. And yet, despite everything, the fading god, the weakening vapors, the uncertain world, the sanctuary still holds a strange magnetism, a soft pull that draws even those who believe the oracle is fading, as though something deep within the earth is calling people to witness its final glow before the last ember cools, as evening descends, and the last pilgrims leave. Their footsteps echo softly along the stone path. In that quiet, you sense that the presence of these final visitors has become part of Delphi's closing chapter, as essential to its story as the kings and warriors who once knelt with burning ambition in their hearts. The end of a sacred place is not marked by a sudden collapse, but by the gentle fading of footsteps, the diminishing of questions, and the soft retreat of the world's attention. As the final decades of Delphi quietly unfolded, a strange stillness settled over the once vibrant sanctuary. The wind slipped between the columns with a gentler voice. Yet, even in these fading years, travelers occasionally made their way up the sacred way, still hoping the old oracle might speak once more. One such traveler arrived in the late autumn. He was an elderly scholar from a distant coastal town, a man who had studied Delphi his entire life without ever visiting. His journey had been long, but he climbed nonetheless, refusing to rest until the sanctuary lay before him. He paused on the upper terrace, taking in the solemn beauty of the sight. The great temple was worn, yet it held a dignity that pressed quietly on the heart. For him, this was the living memory of humanity's oldest questions. He approached the few remaining caretakers, asking nothing more than to stand where countless seekers had stood. After a hushed conversation, they led him into the dim inner chamber. The Pythia no longer spoke often. Her age had taken her strength. But she sat there that evening, wrapped in linen, her face touched by the faint glow of a nearby oil lamp. The scholar lowered himself to his knees. He did not offer gold. Instead, he carried a small, weathered scroll his life's work, a collection of reflections on the ancient prophecies of Delphi. He placed it gently on the stone floor and whispered his question in a voice that trembled with reverence. He did not ask about the future or destiny or fate. Instead, quietly, he asked why humans had ever needed prophecy at all. For a time, the chamber remained silent. The Pythia simply watched him, her gaze soft, almost maternal. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint, like a memory choosing to return. She told him that prophecy had never been about knowing the future. It had been humanity's way of walking toward the unknown with a little more courage. People came to Delphi not for answers, but for reassurance, for the feeling that the universe was listening. Then, with great effort, she lifted her hand and rested it briefly on the scholar's scroll, a silent blessing. Moments later, she closed her eyes, and the chamber dimmed back into quiet. The scholar rose, bowed deeply to the last oracle of Delphi, and stepped out into the cool twilight. He made the slow walk down the hill, cradling the scroll in his hands, not as a scholar, but as a witness. Behind him, Delphi remained still, resting at the edge of its long life. No new prophecy echoed across the stones that evening, yet the sanctuary felt no emptiness. In its quietness, it carried the weight of 1,000 years of human longing. Even as the world changed, Delphi stayed what it had always been, a place where people came not to find fate, but to find themselves. In the days that followed the Pythia's peaceful passing, a profound stillness settled over Delphi, deeper than any quiet the caretakers had known before. It was not the emptiness of abandonment, nor the discomfort of loss. Rather, it was the gentle hush that follows the closing of a long and extraordinary story. The sanctuary, which had once pulsed with the hopes, fears, and ambitions of countless generations, now seemed to exhale, as though relieved of a sacred weight it had carried for centuries. The caretakers moved carefully through the temple grounds, their footsteps softer than usual, as if they feared disturbing the lingering presence of the woman who had been the oracle. They lit the lamps each dawn out of respect, though they knew no supplicant would come now, and they tended the altars with hands that worked more out of memory than necessity. These rituals, once filled with the urgency of prophecy, now felt like a final honoring and acknowledgement of the long journey that Delphi had taken with humanity. Each morning, the sun rose slowly over Mount Parnassus, its golden light sliding across the cracked stone steps and worn columns. illuminating the sanctuary with a warmth that felt like a quiet blessing. And each evening, the mountains cast long protective shadows across the valley, as if the earth itself were guarding the last remnants of a world that had shaped civilization. On the third day after the Pythia's passing, the eldest of the caretakers, aged man with hands as weathered as the temple stones, woke before dawn. He felt a strange certainty in his chest, a guiding sense that the time had come to perform one final act. Without waking the others, he wrapped himself in a wool cloak and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sacred way, once crowded with pilgrims, stretched before him in silence. The rising sun painted the marble surfaces in warm hues, and the faint scent of mountain herbs drifted on the breeze. Walking slowly, he made his way down the path, past the altars and treasuries that had once overflowed with offerings. Many of the structures were now partially ruined, their edges softened by time, but he touched each one gently, as though greeting old friends. When he reached the boundary of the sanctuary, the point where visitors had traditionally paused before entering, he stopped. For centuries, this gate had separated the ordinary world from the sacred one. Now, it felt like the threshold between an ending and the beginning of something quieter, more human. The caretaker knelt, placing both hands on the stone. He whispered a prayer not to the spirits of the mountains, but to the countless generations who had passed through these gates seeking answers they could not find anywhere else. It was a prayer of gratitude for the stories, the questions, the fears, and the hopes that had given Delphi its soul. When he stood again, his movement slow but steady, the sun had fully risen. He walked back up the sacred way, pausing once more at the entrance to the temple. The others greeted him with nods and tired smiles. They all understood, without words, that this dawn marked a turning point. Together, the caretakers gathered the ceremonial objects that had long been part of the Oracle's ritual: the bronze lamp, the small bowl of laurel leaves, the woven cloths, the carved wooden stool. None of these items held power now, but they held memory, and memory deserved respect. With deliberate care, they placed each object inside a small stone chamber near the temple, a place traditionally used to store sacred items no longer in service. When the final item, the laurel crown, was set down, the eldest caretaker closed the heavy stone door. The sound echoed softly, rolling across the empty courtyard like the last line of a whispered prayer. Afterward, the caretakers gathered at the temple entrance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out across the sanctuary. The birds had begun their morning songs, and the air shimmered faintly with warmth. For a moment, none of them moved. Then the eldest spoke, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with the profound gentleness of acceptance. "Delphi has done its work," he said, "and now it may sleep." The others nodded. Without ritual or fanfare, they stepped back into the temple for one final walk. The inner chamber, now illuminated only by the slow-burning lamp, felt peaceful. They bowed before the shrouded form of the last oracle, then blew out the flame. The room dimmed, the shadows lengthened, and the temple fell into a silence deeper than any the caretakers had ever known. Outside, the winds shifted gently, carrying with them the soft scent of pine and earth. The sanctuary stood unbroken, unafraid, a monument not to prophecy, but to the unending human desire to seek meaning in the dark. And in that quiet, Delphi entered its long sleep. Long after the caretakers performed their final duties and allowed the sanctuary to settle into its natural silence, the mountains surrounding Delphi became its quiet guardians. The world below continued to change. New towns grew, old empires faded, and distant civilizations rose with ambitions that echoed those of the ancient Greeks. Yet here, high among the slopes of Parnassus, time seemed to slow its pace, as though the land itself wished to preserve the last traces of a sacred memory. For the first time in centuries, no footsteps climbed the sacred way. The stones, once polished smooth by sandal and chariot wheel, now gathered dust and fallen leaves. Small plants sprouted between them, their delicate roots exploring cracks left by frost and time. Nature did not reclaim Delphi with violence or urgency. It wrapped the sanctuary gently, like a blanket drawn over a sleeping child. Each morning, the sun still rose in its familiar path, sliding across the remains of columns and treasuries, warming the cool marble until it glowed with a faint, hopeful shimmer. And each night, the stars glittered above Delphi with a clarity that cities could no longer witness, their light reflecting faintly off the silent temple walls. With no priests, no supplicants, no offerings, the sanctuary began to take on a different kind of sacredness, one rooted not in ritual, but in memory. Birdsong filled the spaces where chants once echoed. The rustling of pine needles replaced the murmurs of waiting pilgrims. The slow rhythm of seasons replaced the frantic questions of kings. And in this deep, undisturbed quiet, the mountains themselves seemed to take on the role of custodian. During storms, thick clouds gathered around the sanctuary of Apollo, cloaking it in protective darkness. Rain softened the roughness of the stone, washing away centuries of dust. In winter, snow settled gently over the ruins, smoothing the broken lines of the temple and giving it a serene, dreamlike shape as though the oracle were being offered a white shroud from the sky itself. At times, shepherds traveling along distant paths would pause and look toward the ancient sanctuary, sensing a strange peace emanating from it. They did not enter. The place had long since ceased to be part of everyday life. But even from afar, they felt the weight of history lingering in the air, the whisper of stories older than their grandparents, the quiet presence of something that was no longer living, yet not truly gone. Occasionally, a wanderer or scholar would make the long ascent, driven by curiosity rather than faith. These rare visitors found a place suspended between worlds ruined yet dignified, silent yet full of ancient breath. They would walk slowly through the temple grounds, tracing the outlines of collapsed walls with their fingers, imagining the voices that had once filled these spaces. But even they spoke softly, as though afraid to break the fragile hush that draped over the sanctuary. And though no oracle remained, some visitors insisted that Delphi still carried a listening presence. When they stood in the inner chamber, even in its ruined state, they felt something of faint warmth, a stirring of the air, a sense that the stones remembered every question ever whispered into the darkness. Perhaps they imagined it. Perhaps they did not. For places that cradle human longing for as long as Delphi did rarely lose their old powers entirely. Memory, after all, leaves its own kind of spirit behind. And so, through seasons and centuries, the mountains continued their gentle guardianship. The sanctuary slept, but it did not fade. It rested in a quiet between worlds, still watching, still listening, still holding its ancient dignity. It would be many generations before the world returned to rediscover Delphi. But for now, the mountains kept their watch, patient and unhurried. As the centuries drifted onward like soft, slow-moving clouds, Delphi remained tucked within its quiet mountain cradle. Empires continued rising and collapsing far below, but their distant turmoil barely touched the slopes of Parnassus. The sanctuary had learned to exist within a different rhythm, one shaped not by human footsteps or divine proclamations, but by wind, seasons, and the gradual settling of ancient stone. Yet, even in its silence, Delphi did not truly disappear from the world. Stories fragile, half-remembered, reshaped by generations, continued to travel across lands and languages. They moved like wandering embers, carried on a long, gentle breeze. Merchants at faraway markets spoke of a mountain shrine where the gods once answered the questions of mortals. Sailors crossing the Aegean whispered about a sacred place where fate itself once spoke through a woman seated above a mysterious chasm. Scholars in dim candlelit rooms copied fragments of older texts, their handwriting careful. Knowing they were preserving more than history, they were preserving a doorway to an older imagination. These echoes did not reignite Delphi's fame, but they kept its memory warm. Sometimes, traveling poets would reach villages near the mountain and recite tales of the Oracle's power stories where emperors, heroes, and entire nations once waited breathlessly for a single spoken prophecy. Children listened wide-eyed, picturing a world where answers floated up from the earth itself. Their parents listened too, not because they believed, but because the story made the night feel bigger, older, more connected to something ancient. The sanctuary itself, though quiet, seemed to react to these distant murmurs. When sunlight struck the ruins, just right, casting long shadows from the broken columns onto the sacred ground, some travelers swore it felt as though the place stirred ever so slightly, as though memory itself had weight enough to give the air a faint vibration. In the heart of the abandoned temple, the old chasm had long since filled with dust and fallen stone. The vapors were gone, sealed beneath layers of earth, yet many believed that the land still exhaled some invisible presence. Shepherds who passed nearby at night spoke of moments when the wind shifted in strange patterns, curling through the ruins as if following pathways once lined with torches and prayer. They never felt afraid, only watched, as though the mountain were studying them as much as they were studying it. And sometimes, on still evenings, when the sun dipped behind the western peaks, the ruins took on an almost living quiet. The stones held warmth from the day, and the cooling air created faint, whisper-like sounds, little cracks, soft, settling noises, the shared breath of earth and time. Those who happened to stand among the remains felt a profound sense of presence, not supernatural, but deeply human. A reminder that countless lives, countless hopes, countless fears once converged on this single place. It wasn't the voice of the oracle returning. It wasn't prophecy or magic. It was memory, echoing with a persistence that refused to die. Places shaped by longing, by desperate questions, by life-changing decisions, by the weight of entire cities waiting do not vanish easily. Their stories cling to the world even when their walls collapse. And so the Oracle of Delphi, though long silent, continued speaking in another way, not through vapors or trances, but through the quiet endurance of its legend. The mountains held the stone held the memory, and the memory held the echo. Even now, centuries after the sanctuary's last flame burned out, the world seemed somehow aware of Delphi, as though its name was a soft thread woven into the fabric of time. Even after the temple fell silent and the oracle's voice faded into history, something lingered on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. A small number of people continued to live nearby, shepherds, wanderers, and solitary keepers of forgotten traditions. They moved through the landscape with a quiet familiarity, as though they carried an old understanding that the mountain was more than just stone and soil. These people didn't claim to have visions or prophecies. They didn't try to restore the ancient rituals. Instead, they treated the ruins with a kind of gentle respect. They would visit in moments when the world felt heavy or confusing, not to seek answers from the gods, but simply to sit among the remnants of a place where countless others had once searched for meaning. Over time, these quiet visitors became the last keepers of Delphi. They weren't priests or scholars, just ordinary souls who felt something in the air they couldn't quite explain. A subtle pull guided them back again to the cracked steps and the pathways winding between fallen columns. One shepherd, older than most, made a habit of climbing to the temple just before sunrise. He moved slowly through the pale morning light, his worn sandals brushing against loose gravel, his walking stick tapping softly against the stone echo that disappeared quickly into the open air. He never spoke when he reached the inner sanctuary. He would simply stand where the oracle once sat and look out over the valley. In those quiet moments, he felt an odd sense of companionship, not loneliness, not even reverence, something calmer, older, like standing in the presence of memory itself. Another visitor, a young woman from a nearby village, often wandered up to the ruins in the late afternoon. She loved the way the light changed the color of the stones, sometimes honey gold, sometimes soft gray, sometimes almost blue, as the shadows stretched long and thin. She would gently trace the surface of a broken column, following the faint, ancient carvings with her fingertips, wondering what hands had shaped them and what hopes had been carried into this sacred place centuries before she was born. Though she never told anyone, she often whispered stories into the breeze, simple stories from her own life, small questions, quiet fears, knowing the air would carry them away, just as it once carried the frantic questions of kings and envoys. She didn't expect answers, but the act of speaking them aloud in such a place always left her feeling strangely lighter, as though the mountain itself was sharing the weight with her. And there were other travelers from distant regions who had heard fragments of the Oracle's legend in marketplaces and on ships. They arrived without ceremony, walking slowly up the winding path, drawn by something they couldn't define. Some stayed only an hour, others lingered for days, but all of them felt, in some subtle way, that they were touching a place where human longing had once concentrated so intensely that even centuries of silence could not completely dissolve it. None of these visitors believed the oracle would return. They didn't come seeking prophecy. They came seeking perspective. Because Delphi, even in ruins, possessed an unusual gift, the ability to make one's own troubles feel small in the presence of such immense time. Mountains endure in a way human lives do not. Ruins remind us of the countless people who stood right where we stand. And the air above an ancient sanctuary, with all its echoes and layered history, creates a stillness in which the mind can finally breathe. That, in the end, became Delphi's final form, not a center of divine revelation, but a place where silence itself held meaning. And so, the last keepers of the mountain eye, unrecorded by history, continued their gentle visits. Their quiet footsteps ensured that the ancient sanctuary never fully drifted into nothingness, because as long as someone walked among the stones, as long as a single human breath mingled with the wind rising from the valley, the memory of the oracle and the weight of her final days would remain alive in the mountain's timeless calm. Then came a night, centuries after the sanctuary had fallen silent, when a strange unease moved across the slopes of Mount Parnassus. It wasn't violent or sudden, but gentle and deeply instinctive, like the feeling of a room quietly shifting around you while you remain perfectly still. The mountain, which had kept its patient silence for so long, seemed to exhale in a way that unsettled even the most familiar animals. The shepherds who lived nearby felt it first. They spoke later of an hour near midnight when the air grew unusually still. Even the faintest breeze refused to move through the olive trees, leaving the leaves frozen as if painted into the darkness. Dogs that usually slept through the night lifted their heads, ears alert, sensing something deep beneath the earth rather than around them. The sheep shifted uneasily, bunching closer together, guided by an instinct older than human memory. High above, in the ruins of the temple, a thin line of fog began rising from the lower stones. It wasn't dramatic or supernatural, just a whisper of moisture caught in the night air. But the way it curled around the fallen columns made it seem as though the ancient sanctuary was waking from a long sleep, stretching its breath quietly into the sky. For a brief, quiet moment, the valley felt thicker, as if invisible threads of old power were tightening around the shape of the mountain, recalling centuries of prophecy, fear, reverence, and devotion. And yet, nothing visible happened. No tremor, no glow, no voice. Only the sense of something shifting just beneath the surface of the world. A lone traveler passing through on foot later spoke of standing on a ridge and watching the ruins from afar. He said he felt a strange, steady vibration through the stone beneath his boots, so soft it could have been imagined, yet so persistent it made him pause. He felt that the mountain was remembering itself, recalling its ancient purpose in a single, silent motion. Far below, villagers woke from sleep without knowing why. Mothers checked on their children. Old men sat up in their beds, gazing into the dimness. Even the youngest felt something brush against their dreams, subtle tug, like an ancient hand reaching gently across time. And then, just as quietly as it began, the sensation faded. The breeze returned. The animals settled. The fog thinned and drifted away. By morning, the world looked unchanged. The ruins stood as they always had, still, broken and peaceful. But everyone who had felt that strange midnight stillness carried the same unspoken certainty. The mountain had shifted not in stone, but in memory. It was as if Delphi, for one quiet heartbeat, had stirred in its sleep, reminded of what it once was, reminded of the countless souls who climbed to its temple, and of the oracle who had breathed deep the earth's vapors and woven entire destinies with her trembling voice. Nothing came of it. No prophecy awakened. No divine presence returned. But for those who sensed it, the experience became a quiet truth that some places, even in ruin, are never entirely finished speaking. That some histories leave faint ripples long after their final chapter has been written, and that the mountain, ancient and patient, still held the faint, persistent echo of a voice that once shaped the world. The morning after the mountain's quiet stirring arrived slowly, wrapped in a pale gold light that softened the edges of every stone and tree. There was something unusually gentle about the dawn, not brighter, just aware, as though it, too, had sensed whatever moved across the mountain in the night. The shepherds rose early, stepping out into the cool air with a caution they couldn't explain. They paused, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, searching for anything unusual. But all they found was a kind of expectant calm, the sort that settles over a place after a long-held breath has finally been released. Up near the ruined sanctuary, the first rays of sunlight slipped between broken columns, making the old marble glow with a fragile warmth. Dust motes drifted like tiny lanterns through the beams of light. For a moment, the temple's shadows felt softer, less lonely, as though the ancient stones were grateful simply to be noticed again. Two children from a nearby village, sent to collect herbs, wandered close to the ruins, their laughter echoing lightly against the morning. One of them paused suddenly, pointing to a spot where the earth seemed freshly turned, though no footprints marked the soil. It was nothing remarkable, just a small patch of disturbed ground. But something about it felt quietly significant, like the aftermath of a footstep taken by someone who no longer walked on the surface of the world. They stood there for a moment before shrugging and moving on. Children, after all, accept mysteries with a simplicity adults often forget. Down in the village, stories began to form, not out of fear, but curiosity. Old women murmured to one another about strange dreams, dreams of soft voices speaking in tongues they couldn't recall upon waking. A young man tending his goats claimed he smelled something like ancient incense drifting faintly through the air. Another swore the olive trees along the path seemed to shift their leaves all at once, as if responding to a distant call. None of it was dramatic, just little threads of oddness woven quietly into the morning. As the day moved forward, the mountain itself seemed to settle into an almost meditative stillness, as though it had returned to sleep, but lighter now, with the serene restfulness of something that had unburdened itself. Travelers who passed through Delphi in the following days remarked on the same thing, an atmosphere they couldn't name, a gentleness in the air, a hush that felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation. It was as if the land was whispering, "I remember. I am still here. I am not finished." Not with prophecies or fear or grandeur, but with presence. A presence that lingered quietly on the wind, in the earth, in the echoes of birdsong drifting through the abandoned sanctuary. It was a memory continuing not through oracles or visions, but through a silence that asked nothing of anyone, only to be felt. And though the oracle herself had long vanished, the mountain carried her legacy with a tenderness that surprised those who sensed it. Not as legend, not as myth, but as a pulse, soft, steady, endlessly patient. The world moved on, as it always does. Yet Delphi remained, humming faintly in its quiet solitude. A place where even in ruin, something ancient still breathed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time. As the sun climbed higher over the ancient valley, casting long, warm ribbons of light across the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the quiet beneath the earth did not stir, did not shift, did not call attention to itself. Yet it remained present in a way that those who lingered in Delphi for more than a day could not fully explain. It was as though something just out of reach continued to press lightly against the inner walls of the mountain, not demanding to be heard, but simply existing like a heartbeat muffled beneath layers of time. Travelers arriving from distant cities, unaware of the whispers carried by the villagers, felt an unusual heaviness in the air, not a burden, but a gentle weight. It was like stepping into a room where someone had spoken moments before, leaving their voice suspended in the space, still settling into silence. They paused without meaning to, adjusting the straps on their bags, glancing toward the ruins without knowing why, as if drawn by a faint, invisible thread tugging softly at their awareness. On the far side of the valley, where the olive trees grew in careful, ancient terraces carved generations ago, an elderly man named Nikandros stopped mid-step while tending to his grove. He lowered his basket slowly, unsure what had caught his attention. The wind had paused. The cicadas held their breath for the briefest instant, and in that stillness, he thought he felt something subtle beneath his feet. It was a vibration so soft it could easily have been imagination, like the distant memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. He stood entirely still, listening not with his ears, but with something deeper, something instinctual. There, was no danger, no warning, just the strange certainty that the mountain was remembering something old. He whispered the name out of habit more than belief. Pythia, and the moment passed. The cicadas resumed their steady chorus. The leaves trembled again under the lazy movement of the breeze, and life slipped back into motion around him. He lifted his basket and returned to his task, though a small part of him carried that fleeting sensation with him for the rest of the day. Like a thread of a dream he couldn't fully recall. Up at the sanctuary ruins, a marble fragment near the temple's foundation shifted ever so slightly as the morning warmth expanded the ancient stone. A tiny crack edged a little farther along its surface, revealing a darker, untouched layer beneath. It was merely the natural process of time and weather, but even this small change felt oddly significant, as if the mountain was turning a page in a book no one could read anymore. A pair of travelers, young scholar and her companion, wandered into the ruins that afternoon. They spoke quietly, their voices blending with the soft hiss of the wind as they traced the outlines of the fallen columns. The scholar paused near the Adaton, the inner chamber where the oracle once sat. Though she tried to dismiss it, a shiver ran lightly down her arms, not from cold, but from a sudden sense of being observed, not threatened, not watched in the human sense, just acknowledged, as though the space itself recognized her presence and welcomed her curiosity. She knelt beside a fragment of carved stone and brushed her fingertips across its surface, and for an instant she felt the faintest warmth. Again, easily explained by sunlight, yet the warmth seemed to pulse, slow and soft, like the echo of breath held long ago. She did not mention it to her companion. Some experiences feel too delicate to speak aloud. The day drifted onward with that same gentle strangeness, nothing that would ever be recorded or retold as an omen or a sign. Just small, subtle impressions scattered across the valley like seeds carried on a quiet wind. A shepherd hearing a distant hum that faded before he could place it. A traveler dreaming of a woman's voice speaking in a language she didn't know, yet feeling comforted upon waking. A stray dog refusing to go near the temple's entrance, not out of fear, but out of reverence, sitting instead a short distance away, as though keeping watch. It was as if the mountain, in its deep silence, had begun to breathe again. Not loudly, not boldly, just enough to remind the world that some stories do not end simply because the people who lived them have faded from memory. Delphi, wrapped in its quiet sunlight and gentle winds, remained a place where echoes still lived, faint, patient, and endlessly persistent beneath the shifting earth. By the time the afternoon light softened into the gentle gold of early evening, a quiet hush began to settle over the valley in a way that felt noticeably different from the usual rhythm of day turning into dusk. It was not heavier nor darker, but deeper, like the entire landscape was carefully lowering its voice, preparing itself to listen to something subtle that might drift through the air if the world remained still enough. Shadows from the scattered cypress trees stretched long and thin across the ancient pathways, their shapes merging with the worn grooves left by centuries of footsteps. The stones themselves, weathered, chipped, half-buried, seemed to take on a certain presence in the fading light, as though they were aware that the night would soon bring a kind of clarity daylight never quite allowed. In Delphi, dusk had always been a moment of transition, but now it carried an almost fragile tension, the kind that makes even the smallest rustle of a leaf feel meaningful. Far up the hillside, where the sacred path once wound its way toward the heart of the sanctuary, a lone traveler named Dorian paused as he reached the remains of an ancient terrace. He was not here for worship or history. He had come only to escape the noise of the towns below. Yet, as he stood there, watching the sky shift into layers of lavender and rose, he felt an inexplicable sensation wash over him, feeling that the air itself was aware of his presence. He tilted his head slightly, sensing something he couldn't name. A faint vibration in the atmosphere, like the lingering trace of a voice that had spoken only moments before he arrived. A feeling of being greeted by something older than memory. He remained still for a long moment, letting the gentle breeze move past him, carrying with it a whisper of cold from the upper slopes. There was no sound, no chant, no murmur. He felt a strange certainty that the valley around him was holding a story just beneath the surface of silence, waiting for someone patient enough to perceive it. Down below, the first lights of the village began to flicker on, warm and soft, forming a necklace of small, glowing dots across the landscape. The shepherds were guiding their animals home, and the scent of wood smoke drifted upward from hearths beginning to warm for the night. Yet, even in this ordinary routine, a lingering sense of expectation clung to the air, like a question that had not yet found its voice. near the ruins of the temple, where marble fragments caught the last rays of sunlight, a slow cooling began to settle into the stones. As the heat faded, the air between the columns seemed to shift slightly, an almost imperceptible ripple, as though the space was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Nothing moved, nothing changed, yet the atmosphere felt charged in a quiet, patient way, not with power, but with memory. For Delphi had always been a place where memory lived, not only in the stones, but in the very air itself. Stories, offerings, footsteps, whispered prayers, centuries of human presence had seeped into the landscape, creating a kind of invisible archive that the wind occasionally brushed its fingers across. Tonight, as dusk deepened, it seemed those memories were stirring again to reveal themselves fully, but to rise gently to the surface like faint echoes. A young woman gathering herbs near the temple suddenly stopped and looked around, certain she had heard someone call her name, though no one was nearby. A group of travelers heading toward the village felt an unexpected moment of disorientation, as if a shadow had passed through them, leaving behind a trace of warmth rather than cold. Even the birds overhead circled once more than usual before settling into their nests, as though momentarily uncertain. The valley was calm. The world was peaceful, but something beneath the visible surface was subtly shifting, like a thread of ancient breath weaving itself back into the fabric of the evening. And above it all, the mountain stood silently, dignified as ever, carrying within its deep and echoing heart the remnants of a voice the world once traveled great distances to hear. A voice that, even in its silence, seemed somehow closer than before. As the final traces of daylight withdrew from the slopes of Mount Parnassus and the first cool breath of night swept gently across the valley, Delphi shifted into a silence that felt markedly different from the quiet of the afternoon. It wasn't empty or lonely, but profoundly attentive, as though the darkness itself had settled with a purpose, lowering its weight softly over the land like a blanket carefully placed upon a resting child. The sky deepened into a rich indigo, scattered with early stars that blinked through the thinning veil of dusk. Each one appeared with a calm steadiness that made the world seem momentarily suspended between breath and stillness. The moon rose slowly, pale and watchful, casting a faint silver glow over the broken colonnades and ancient steps, turning even the smallest fragment of marble into a quiet witness to the unfolding night. Down in the village, lamps flickered in windows, and soft conversations drifted from open doorways. But even those humble sounds faded as the villagers settled into their routines, closing shutters, extinguishing fires, whispering brief prayers before sleep. A kind of hush descended, not because anyone feared the dark, but because the night felt unusually delicate, as if any loud movement might disturb something unseen. Up near the forgotten sanctuary, the air held a cool clarity that made every faint movement of the wind feel intentional. The olive trees swayed just enough to rustle, their leaves brushing together in a soft whisper that echoed faintly against the stone walls. It was a gentle sound, but somehow it carried an undercurrent of depth, like an old melody played slowly and almost inaudibly on a distant instrument. A young traveler named Lysandra, who had chosen to camp near the ruins to avoid the crowded village inns, sat quietly beside her small fire. She watched the embers pulse with a dim, reddish glow. She had expected the night to feel eerie, perhaps even unsettling, surrounded by the broken remains of a place once filled with pilgrims and priests. Yet, instead, she felt an unexpected sense of calm, sensation as though she were not alone, but peacefully accompanied and patient. At one point, she lifted her head, certain she had heard a soft sigh carried by the breeze. Not human, not animal, just a faint exhale, almost indistinguishable from the sound of wind passing through narrow spaces. She listened, her breath slowing, waiting for it to repeat. But the night only settled deeper around her, and she could not tell whether the sound had been real or merely her mind blending imagination with the soft rhythm of the air. Farther up the slope, the entrance to the old adyton, the sanctuary's innermost chamber, was swallowed in shadow. Yet the darkness there felt different, not foreboding, but expectant, as though the hollow stone space within held onto a memory that might drift outward if the world grew quiet enough. A thin current of cool air slipped from the opening, brushing lightly across the scattered debris outside, stirring a few grains of dust into a slow, spiraling dance. The dust rose only an inch or two before settling again, but the movement felt strangely deliberate, as if the mountain were testing the faintest remnant of old breath. Even the animals sensed something subtle in the air. A lone owl perched high among the branches of a cypress turned its head slowly toward the sanctuary and remained motionless for several heartbeats before lifting into the sky without making a sound. A fox paused on its nightly prowl, sniffing the air before retreating toward the lower fields instead of climbing the rocky paths. Nothing dramatic happened. No vision, no tremor, no sudden shift. And yet, the entire valley seemed to lean just slightly toward the mountain, as though listening for a whisper that had not yet come. Night deepened further, settling into a calm so profound it felt almost sacred. The darkness wrapped around the ruins, soft and cool, carrying with it the faint sensation that the boundary between the present and the ancient past had thinned by the smallest, almost imperceptible degree. And for those who remained awake, whether by the ruins or in the quiet village below, there was a shared, unspoken awareness that something in Delphi had not simply stayed alive in memory, but had begun, slowly and silently, to stir. The deep night settled over Delphi with a softness that felt almost luminous, as though the darkness itself had absorbed the silver glow of the moon and was now releasing it back into the valley in a faint, diffused shimmer. The mountains stood silhouetted against the sky, their ridges outlined in pale threads of moonlight, giving them an almost otherworldly present, solemn and quietly alive in their stillness. The air carried a crispness that made each breath feel cool and unhurried, the kind of air that encourages the mind to slow down, to drift away from hurried thoughts and sink into a deeper, quieter rhythm. The world seemed to lie perfectly balanced between movement and rest, as if every tree, every stone, every shadow had agreed to pause and simply be. Lysandra, a traveler who had set her small camp near the ruins, lay awake on her blanket, watching the slow progression of stars across the sky. Their motion was almost imperceptible, a gentle shift rather than a journey. Yet she found herself entranced by the subtlety of it. The constellations appeared familiar, but the longer she observed them, the more it seemed that a few stars shone brighter than she remembered, tiny points of light that twinkled with a thin, steady pulse like distant lanterns signaling from across the vastness. She felt strangely attuned to the night, as though her senses had become delicate instruments tuned to the faintest vibrations in the air. When she closed her eyes, she could feel a soft thrum beneath her, a whisper of movement deep under the earth. Not a sound, not a tremor, like the slow heartbeat of the mountain itself echoing through the ground. It wasn't frightening, It wasn't even surprising. It simply felt ancient. As though the mountain had always carried this quiet rhythm, and she was only now relaxed enough, still enough, to notice it. Not far from where she lay, the scattered remnants of the temple cast long dark lines across the stone floor. A single broken column reflected the moonlight in a way that almost resembled a faint movement. Of course, it did not move yet. The light upon it flickered softly, as though responding to something invisible drifting by. High on the slope, a thin wisp of cold air slipped through a narrow crack in the rock, emerging with a low, almost melodic sigh. The sound was so delicate that even the night insects paused for a brief moment, as if listening. Then, slowly, they resumed their quiet chorus, weaving their soft drone back into the fabric of the night. Down in the village, most of the residents slept soundly, but an elderly woman named Thalia stirred in her bed, awoken not by a noise, but by a sensation of feeling that someone had whispered her name from far away, from a place beyond walls and distance. She opened her eyes and listened, her breath slowing as she focused on the faint sounds drifting through the window. Hush! But all she heard was the gentle swaying of the trees, the distant hum of insects, and the steady rhythm of the night. Still, she felt the lingering echo of that whisper, soft and comforting, like a memory she had forgotten she carried. Back at the ruins, Lysandra finally closed her eyes, letting the peace of the night wrap around her. As she drifted toward sleep, she had the sensation that something ancient was rising slowly from the depths. Not in a physical sense, not in any way that disturbed the earth, but in the manner of an old story lifting itself from silence, preparing to be remembered. The breeze brushed gently across her face, carrying with it the faint scent of thyme and cool stone. Somewhere in the darkness, the subtle pulse of the mountain continued its slow rhythm, steady and calm, as though the land itself were breathing beneath a blanket of stars. And high above it, all the sky shimmered with a quiet clarity that made every star feel slightly closer, slightly warmer, as if the universe itself were leaning in to listen to the ancient hush that had settled over Delphi. A hush filled not with emptiness, but with the patient, persistent echo of something that had never truly gone. The night deepened in a way that felt almost intentional, as though the darkness itself were settling into place, layer by layer, folding over the valley with a careful hand. The air grew cooler, but not unkindly. Soot was the kind of gentle chill that encourages stillness, the kind that quiets the mind and allows every small detail of the world clearer and more meaningful. Lysandra shifted slightly beneath her blanket, though she remained on the delicate threshold between wakefulness and dream. The faint pulse she had sensed earlier, the subtle heartbeat of the mountain, seemed to grow a little more distinct. Not louder, but more present. It was as though the mountain had not changed at all, but she had become more receptive to its ancient rhythm. A soft rustle brushed through the grass near her, but it wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was lighter, finer, almost like silk sliding across stone. The sound traveled slowly, drifting across the ruins with a measured calm, weaving its way between broken pillars and crumbled walls before reaching the quiet clearing where she rested. For a moment, Lysandra opened her eyes. The moonlight had dimmed, slightly hidden, partly behind a thin veil of drifting cloud, and the shadows had grown softer, blending into one another, until the ruins seemed less like physical remnants and more like shapes drawn in charcoal against the pale earth. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, yet the air felt fuller, as though an unseen presence had quietly settled into the space around her. She sat up, slowly, half awake, half dreaming, her gaze moving across the darkened temple floor. The broken column she had watched earlier appeared unchanged, but there was something different in the way the shadows gathered near its base, a faint shimmer, a kind of trembling in the air that lasted only a moment before disappearing. She didn't feel fear, just curiosity wrapped in the comfort of the night's stillness. Somewhere deeper within the ruins, a low sound emerged. It was not quite a breath and not quite a voice, but something in between Nan's exhale that carried the weight of age, of memory, of something that had remained silent for too long. The sound traveled along the stone pathways with slow patience, like water finding its course after a long drought. Lysandra held her breath, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, rising from a narrow fissure beneath one of the temple platforms. The opening had always been there, a natural split in the rock, but tonight it seemed to release a faint warmth, as though breath were drifting upward from deep beneath the earth. It reminded her of the descriptions she had heard from old stories accounts of the vaporous whispers that once rose from the hidden chambers. Below the Oracle's seat, the sacred breath that had carried prophecies into the minds of priestesses. People had once believed the earth itself spoke through these vents, its wisdom rising like mist into the still air. And though the oracle was long gone, though the prophecies had faded into history, the mountain still held its breath just beneath the stone. The faint warmth rose again, brushing against her skin like a soft, invisible hand. It carried no words, no message, nothing that could be understood. But it held a sense of recognition, as though something ancient had stirred briefly. Not fully awakened, but gently acknowledging the presence of someone who had come in quiet respect rather than expectation. High above, the veil of cloud shifted, letting the moonlight return. Silver light spilled once more across the ruins, touching the stones with a glow that made them look almost newly carved, as if time itself had softened for a moment. Lysandra lowered herself back onto her blanket, the sensation of the mountain's whisper still lingering faintly in the air. The breeze remained gentle, the night insects steady in their rhythm, and the valley once again felt like a vast cradle of silence. But beneath it, all beneath the surface, beneath the earth, beneath the weight of centuries, the whisper continued, patient and steady, as if waiting for the right moment to rise again. A moment that had not yet come, but was drawing quietly, imperceptibly closer. The night moved forward with a kind of steady, unbroken quiet that feels almost suspended in time, as if each passing second were stretching itself gently so the darkness could linger just a little longer before surrendering to dawn. The valley beneath Delphi remained still, wrapped in a coolness that softened every outline and blurred the boundary between the waking world and the drifting realm of dreams. Lysandra lay with her eyes half closed, listening to the muted chorus of the night. Yet her attention stayed fixed on the fissure beneath the ruins. It appeared so subtle at first that anyone else might have mistaken it for nothing more than a stray breath of air, but to her now, tuned to the rhythm of this ancient place, felt deliberate, like the quiet inhalation of something deep within the mountain. For a few long moments, nothing changed. The warmth pulsed softly, then retreated, then returned, barely enough to be felt. Almost like the slow rise and fall of lungs resting in profound sleep. And then, only for an instant, the warmth carried something new, a scent. It was faint, nearly lost to the coolness of the night, but unmistakable all the same. A faint hint of wild laurel, the same plant priests once burned in sacred rituals, the same herb that had crowned the brows of ancient Pythias before they delivered their visions. The scent drifted upward like a memory rising from deep water, soft and elusive, vanishing as soon as she tried to draw it in. Lysandra's breath caught not from fear, but from a quiet awe that settled over her like a second blanket. She had not come seeking spirits or prophecies, yet she felt the presence of something older than stories, older than carvings, older even than the ruins themselves. Deep below, the mountain shifted with a whisper too low to be sound, a tremble not physical, not enough to move a grain of dust, but enough for her to sense through the stillness. It was like the echo of a voice spoken ages ago, finally reaching the surface after traveling through the long corridors of time. The breeze changed direction, moving from the mouth of the valley upward toward the ruins, carrying with it the distant rustle of pine trees swaying in the dark. Their branches brushed against each other with soft, whispering strokes, almost as if murmuring back to the mountain in a language only the land understood. Far off, an owl released a single, slow call, the sound drifting across the slopes like a small ripple in a calm lake before fading into the vastness of the night. Lysandra rose to a sitting position again, her movements deliberate, her senses sharpened by the quiet expectancy that now hung in the air. She could see the shape of the temple floor spread out before her, the remnants of an age when people had come with questions heavy in their hearts, when priestesses had spoken words that seemed to come from the earth itself. The broken stones and cracked foundations looked almost luminous under the moon, glowing with the pale softness of weathered bone. And as she watched, something subtle began to shift in the deepest shadow underneath the temple platform. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't light. It was more like an awareness, like the shadow itself becoming conscious that someone was observing it and responding with the faintest flicker of presence. The warmth rising from the fissure grew softer again, then steadier, as if matching the rhythm of her breathing. For a moment, she wondered whether she was imagining all of this, whether the stillness of the night had simply made her mind more sensitive to things she would normally overlook. But deep inside, she knew the mountain had begun to stir long before she arrived. Its whisper had always been there, quiet, patient, waiting. She had merely been still enough to hear it. A soft sigh passed through the ruins, so light it might have been breeze, yet so steady it felt purposeful, like an exhale released after centuries of silence. The moon drifted behind another thin cloud, dimming the valley once more. And for a long moment, everything fell into a profound, breath-held stillnesses, though the night itself were listening. And in that stillness, Lysandra felt something approaching. Not a presence walking toward her, not a shape forming in the shadows, but a sense of movement from deep beneath. The earth rising slowly, making its way toward the surface with the patience of something that had waited far too long to be heard. Something was coming, softly, steadily, inevitably, and the mountain, once silent, once dormant, was no longer asleep. Night settled over Delphi like a veil of brushed silver. Night settled over Delphi like a veil of brushed silver. Within the temple, the last glow of the braziers trembled, as if unsure whether to keep burning or surrender to the darkness. The silence inside the sanctuary felt heavier than before, older, too, as if the very stones sensed that the end of their sacred purpose was creeping closer with each passing hour. The priestess older now than she ever imagined she would live to be set near the deep fissure at the heart of the Adaton. Her fingers resting against the cool marble floor, she knew the chamber the way a dying person knows the rhythm of her own breath, every crack, every echo, every hidden pulse beneath the surface. Once she would sit here and feel the earth rumble faintly beneath her, as if the god himself whispered through the trembling ground. But now the floor was still quiet in a way that felt unnatural. For a long moment, she simply breathed in the cool dryness of the chamber. The scent that had once carried faint hints of resin, laurel, and volcanic vapors now smelled only of stone and age. She whispered to herself, not to Apollo, not to the fading priests, but to the memories that clung to her like shadows. She remembered the seasons when this sanctuary overflowed with pilgrims, each bearing questions they believed only the god could answer. She remembered the warmth of sunlight on the temple steps, the murmur of prayers in dozens of languages, the sound of sandals dragging nervously across the marble. She remembered how, in those days, she could lose herself completely in the trance, how the world fell away, and a brighter, deeper voice filled her mind with truths she could never have known herself. But tonight, as she waited, that voice did not come, and she knew why. Rome had come. Not a single army, but a tide of new gods, new rules, new philosophies, new demands. They did not need her visions. They did not want her mysteries. They wanted order, certainty, uniform belief under the banner of a rising faith that had no room for the old ways. She heard footsteps outside the chamber, slow, respectful, and familiar. The high priest entered, his white robe dim in the flickering light. His face was worn with years of worry, his eyes carrying the same truth she had already accepted. "It is silent again?" he asked softly. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the fissure. "He has withdrawn," she murmured. "Or perhaps he was never here as we believed." The high priest inhaled sharply, not out of shock, but out of sorrow. "Do not say such things. The God has spoken through you for decades. You carried his voice longer than any mortal should." She smiled, a thin, tired curve of the lips. "Or perhaps I carried only the voice people needed, a mirror for their hopes and their fears." The high priest closed his eyes. He did not argue, and that silence was an answer in itself. For a moment, they simply sat, their two relics of a fading world. The last warmth from the braziers dissolved into the night. Outside, the faint cry of an owl cut through the air, a lonely sound that echoed through the abandoned courtyards. Then, in the deep quiet, she whispered, "Will they come tomorrow?" "Yes," he replied. "Roman officials, they wish to cess the site. Officially," she understood. "To shut it down." He bowed his head. "Yes." The priestess exhaled slowly. "Then tonight is the last night," the Oracle of Delphi breathes. Her words settled heavily between them, but she did not weep. She had lived inside this sacred service for so long that she had already mourned its death many times in her heart. What she felt now was something quieter, an acceptance shaped by decades of visions, rituals, and fading echoes. The high priest gently placed a hand on the stone beside her. "If there is anything you wish to do, anything you wish to say, this is the moment." She closed her eyes and lifted her face toward the void above. There was no vapor rising from the fissure, no tremor in the earth, no divine spark setting her mind alight. Instead, she felt only her own heart beat steady, human, mortal. "I wish to say," she whispered, "that we served the world as best we could. We gave comfort to those who came in fear. We offered clarity to those drowning in doubt. If those words came from the God, then may He forgive us for failing Him in the end. And if those words came only from within ourselves, then perhaps we were wiser than we realized." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of truth long unspoken. The high priest bowed deeply. Then let your final night be peaceful. She nodded, but as he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The faintest breeze, cold and thin as a dying breath, slipped across the chamber. It brushed the hem of her robe, stirred a strand of her hair, and carried with it a whisper so soft she could not tell whether it came from the earth or only from her memory. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, just one, she felt something beneath the stone. A pulse, a tremor, a flicker of something ancient trying to speak against the silence. The priestess did not call after the high priest. She did not claim to have heard the god again. She simply placed her hand against the floor, warm now. Or perhaps she only believed it was unbreathed in the last fragile whisper of a world slipping quietly into history. She whispered one final phrase. Even endings have a voice. And the chamber fell silent.